Shabbat Shalom. I would like to, with God's help, to share this week's reading, which is the first reading in the book of Exodus. Until now, we have been reviewing the book of Genesis, and now we're talking about the book of Exodus, the very first reading, called Exodus. And we're going to repeat something we said last time, that the children of Israel, who basically numbered 70, and this is without the slaves and other people who were part of the tribe, but they're not mentioned in the Torah. 70 Israelites, children of Jacob, come down to Egypt. We go down into Egypt as a family, and in the book of Exodus, of course, a few weeks from now, a few readings from now, we leave Egypt, not as a family, but as a nation. Whereas there was no Judaism, per se, in the book of Genesis. What we had in Genesis was a shepherd family, a tribe, blessed very specially by God. But there was no real Judaism, per se, as we know it, in the book of Genesis. There was a certain morality, certain ethics, very great teachings, going all the way back to Noah. When we come out of Egypt in the book of Exodus, we don't come out as a family, we come out as a nation. And we come out to Mount Sinai and we develop a religion. One of the things I wanted to share is something that is not in the Torah. And as I wrote my 6th book about Exodus, I go back 25 years to the time that I was in seminary. And I was studying to be a conservative rabbi. God had other plans for me, so I never got smicha. I never got the ordination as a conservative rabbi. Maybe there was a good thing out of that, because I became a teacher to millions and millions of non-Jews all over the world. We Jewish people have something which I'm going to discuss in the next week's reading called the phylacteries. And this appears in Exodus 13. And I'm not talking about it today, I'm talking about it next time, but we wear this on our forehead and on our left arm, and it's a perfectly black cube. And I was in seminary and I asked my teachers, what do you think about these phylacteries? You know, where did they come from? And one of the very first things we did in the Jewish Theological Seminary, and I praise my professor at that time, Professor Israel Lee Levine, he took a quote from the Christian book, the New Testament. And it was from Matthew 23, verse 5. And it talks about the Pharisees. And Jesus is criticizing the ostentatiousness of the rabbis, saying, for all their works they do for to be seen of men, they make broad their phylacteries, and they enlarge the tzitzit on their prayer shawl. In the English, it says the hems of their garments. And the reason that we were taught this in seminary was basically to give a proof outside of the Jewish rabbinic text, because the New Testament is a Jewish book, but it is outside of the Canaan, it is outside of the ordained or holy rabbinic Jewish text, that the Jews indeed used the phylacteries and the prayer shawl around the year 2000, around the year 0 of the Common Era, or CE. There are no rabbinic documents talking about the phylacteries 2,000 years ago. There was a German theologian a few hundred years ago by the name of Wellhausen who said that the Jews invented the phylacteries in the more recent times, just a few hundred years ago. But the fact is, if this is mentioned in the New Testament, this is like archaeological proof that the phylacteries were actually indeed in use 2,000 years ago. And Yigael Yadin, a famous general in the Israeli army, found archaeological specimens of the phylacteries in Masada, among the 900 people who committed suicide rather than surrender to the Romans, and in Kibbutz Beit Alpha. And so we have archaeological proof, and we have proof from the New Testament, which is very important for Jewish people to know, that the phylacteries are indeed mentioned in the New Testament. And so, for purposes of this weekly reading, I asked, how long is it that we've been using these phylacteries? And the rabbis, the professors said, well, this goes back to Mount Sinai after we left Egypt. But if you turn to Exodus 13, which is what we're going to do in a few weeks from now, you see that indeed these phylacteries were given to us while we were still in Egypt. This is before we reached Mount Sinai. And so what I wanted to do now was, and I will repeat some of this in 2 weeks from now, but what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit more about Moses. We read in the very first reading of Exodus that the Israelites were fruitful and they multiplied. According to the Jewish tradition, the Jewish people, the Israelites, were in Egypt for 400 years, but the length of our lives, the longevity of our lives, was on the average 130 to 150 years. And don't forget, Jacob dies at age 147. And his father and his grandfather lived even longer. And so people were living 100 plus years and bearing many, many children. So 3 generations in Egypt, we grew from 70 to hundreds of thousands. And as I said also about Ishmael in last week's reading, that Ishmael had 12 kids, 12 boys, but he probably had 12 girls too. And the children and the children's children, all these people were multiplying and filling up the earth with children. And so the same happened in Egypt. The Israelites were living in Goshen, and which is a very fertile place, the Nile Delta. And the Israelites in 3 generations swelled to a tremendous amount of people. By the time we left Egypt, it was 600,000 men, an astronomical figure. It's hard to understand really how we did it. But the Egyptians at that time felt extremely threatened by this population explosion of the children of Jacob in Egypt. So we see a story about Pharaoh ordering the killing of the male Israelites. Let the girls live and kill the boys. And the big hero in the very first reading of Exodus is, of course, Moses. Moses is born to Amram and Yocheved, and Yocheved is the daughter of Levi, who was one of the sons of Jacob. Amram actually, I think, marries his aunt. Things were a little different. Rules were a little different in those days about marriage. People lived very, very long lives. Sometimes you might find you're marrying your aunt and she's younger than you are. That happens today too. And they have a child by the name of Moses. Also they have Aaron, and also they have Miriam. And they hide Moses away for a time, and then finally they have to either kill him or hide him somewhere in the Nile River in a basket. And so Miriam puts him in the Nile River in the reeds, very close to where the daughter of Pharaoh lives. And the story is, of course, that Pharaoh hears the crying of the baby Moses, picks him up out of the Nile, and decides to raise him as her own child because the daughter of Pharaoh is childless. And here comes something very interesting. The Torah is not a book of history. The Torah is a book of historiography. In other words, it gives select pieces of history, but it omits many other pieces of history which are really essential in order to understand the Torah properly. I won't go into the reasons why great parts of the history are overlooked or omitted from the Torah. But there is a story that we see in the Torah. We know he was born. We know he was hidden away. We know that Pharaoh's daughter picked him up out of the Nile. And then the next thing we read is that Moses kills an Egyptian slave driver, taskmaster, for beating a Jew almost to death. And then all of a sudden he has to disappear. He has to go to Jethro. And the rabbis and the synagogues don't really discuss what is this all about and what are the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle that we are missing. Now, firstly, let's think for a moment logically. Moses is raised in the home of Pharaoh. And there are many, many different historiographic teachings that Moses actually was trained, educated to be Pharaoh. And as I said in previous teachings, in Arabic, the Muslims call Egypt ad-Dunya, or the mother of the world. And so I believe if Moses was raised and educated in Pharaoh's house, he probably got the best education that Egypt had to offer. And so he knew geography. Moses knew about all the nations that surrounded Egypt. He knew about the nations to the west in Africa, east in West Africa. He knew about the nations to the south in what is today Sudan or Ethiopia, the headwaters of the Nile. He knew about what was going on the other side of the pond, which was Arabia. He knew about the Hyksos, and he knew about all these Canaanite and Hebrew tribes. He knew geography very well. He knew exactly who he was, where he was. There is an historian by the name of Josephus, and I know many of you have the books of Josephus at home. Josephus was a Jewish general who, instead of committing suicide, when many times the Romans were winning, the Israelites, the Jews decided to commit suicide rather than to be taken prisoner and enslaved by the Romans. And so Josephus decided to surrender and offer his services to the Romans as an historian. And the simple truth, the simple facts are that from his books, especially Antiquities of the Jews, our archaeologists have been able to pinpoint very important places in the land of Israel, to find archaeological places proving that the Bible is not fantasy, the Bible is not fables and vain genealogies. The Bible actually did take place as the Bible says, and the archaeologists, based on Josephus's descriptions of the land of Israel, have been able to find places that are mentioned in the Bible that otherwise would have been lost to us. And indeed, Yigael Yadin went to Masada and he found the phylacteries as part of the description of Josephus of Masada. And so the story that Josephus tells, which I think is extremely critical, is that Moses goes to war in Africa. And what happened was that the African nation, we don't know, was it Sudan? We don't know, was it Ethiopia? In Hebrew, the word is Cush. And what we know from Josephus is that an army came from Cush, from Africa, and conquered Egypt. And Pharaoh was helpless in fighting off these African people. And it seems there was no pharaonic leader who was ready to lead an army against these Cushites. And Moses said, you know what, let me do it. And those pharaonic people who hated Moses because of his Hebrew slave blood said, yeah, let Moses do it. Moses will probably be killed. And the story from Josephus, and there are variations of the story from Yalkut Shimoni, which is the Midrash, and the book of Jasher, or in Hebrew, Sefer HaYashar. There are 3 different stories about Moses going to Africa, leading an army from Egypt, the pharaonic army, and defeating the Cushites. And I know our time is running out for this specific segment, but if you remember further on, we see that Miriam talks bad about the Cushite wife that Moses had taken. And this Cushite wife, according to Josephus, was a princess, and she was the daughter of the king of the Cushites. And when Moses' army succeeded in surrounding the city of the Cushites, this Cushite princess fell in love with Moses. She saw him from the parapets, and she sneaked out through the back door of the city, and she went to Moses and said if he married her, she would surrender the city to him without any bloodshed. And so indeed Moses, according to Josephus, marries the Cushite princess, consummates the marriage, and takes the city, and he saves Egypt from falling to the Cushites. And this is something which is not in the Torah, and in the next weekly reading I will refer to this also, because Moses goes then to Jethro and flees after he kills the taskmaster. Shabbat Shalom.